All right, everyone. We are at the end of this 24-hour marathon of liberty. We have one final thing, a panel of 3 speakers. You know what the panel is on, but let me say a few things. First, it was Milton Friedman who published an essay 53 years ago. The essay was called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." Decades later, obviously, it's even more important to examine his warnings about corporate leaders who, I quote, declaim that business is not concerned merely with profit, but also with promoting desirable social ends. That business has a social conscience and takes seriously its responsibilities for providing employment, eliminating discrimination, avoiding pollution, and whatever else may be the catchwords of the contemporary crop of reformers. That was back in 1970, and you can see how much even more relevant it is today. Today's woke tycoons are preaching what Friedman used to call pure and unadulterated socialism under the label ESG. Businessmen, said Friedman, who talk this way are unwitting puppets of the intellectual forces that have been undermining the basis of a free society. So now we are going to examine the latest threats facing the leaders of the global free enterprise system, their shareholders, employees, and customers. And it is my great pleasure to present to you 3 people. First, Dr. Charles Steele, who holds the Herman and Suzanne Detweiler Chair in Economics at Hillsdale College and regularly teaches the Austrian economics class as well as history of economic thought, same things that I'm doing here at Northwood. With his international teaching experience in places like China and Ukraine and Russia, Dr. Steele is not your typical college professor. He explains that these experiences opened his eyes to the gulf of economics knowledge between students in the East and the West. Most of his students in China and post-Soviet Russia and places like Bulgaria, and let's face it, who were part of the Soviet bloc, had never been exposed to economic principles and theories. While difficult at first, Dr. Steele says that his experiences teaching in those countries was extremely rewarding. To this day, he continues to keep in touch with many of those students. Next, we have Donald Kochan, who is a professor of law and deputy executive director of the Law and Economics Center at George Mason University. Before joining the Antonin Scalia Law School faculty, he was the Parker Kennedy Professor in Law at Chapman University's Fowler School of Law from 2004 to 2020. From 2003 to 2004, Professor Kochan was an Olin Fellow at the University of Virginia School of Law. During 2002 and 2003, he was a visiting assistant professor of law at George Mason Scalia Law School. Professor Kochan's scholarship focuses on areas of property law, constitutional law, administrative law, natural resources and environmental law, tort law, and law and economics. We, by the way, have a chapter by him in our Northwood Bible when we are free. He had published more than 40 scholarly articles and essays in well-regarded law journals, and his work has been cited in dozens of books and in hundreds of published law review articles. Last but not least, my friend Tawni Ferrarini, who has a PhD and joined Lindenwood University in August 2017. Tawni, if you're online, we have one of your students here. You may remember Beth Thomas.
Yes.
She is sitting right across from me here, and she's been teaching our students for a few years now. Okay, Tawni Ferrarini is a member of the economics faculty in the Plaster School of Business and Entrepreneurship and a senior research fellow in the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise, that is in Lindenwood University. In addition to her duties As a faculty member, she has a role to work with the School of Education to create programs at Lindenwood University for training educators to teach economics and financial literacy and improve economics education statewide. Until 2017, Dr. Ferrarini held the only endowed professorship at Northern Michigan University. That's where she was teaching our faculty member now, Beth Thomas. She was the Sam Cohordes Professor of Economics. She was the 2015 President of the National Association of Economic Educators. Currently, she serves as the Distinguished Professor of Economics Education at the Council of Economic Education in Japan, a Senior Fellow at the McNair Center for Public Policy right here in Midland, Michigan, and the Fraser Institute in Vancouver, Canada. She is a co-author of Common Sense Economics, What Everyone Should Know About Wealth and Prosperity, and she actually had the pleasure of learning from one of my favorite economists, that's Nobel laureate from 1993, Doug North. Okay, well, welcome everyone online, and we are starting with a couple of pre-recorded talks. First, Charles Steele, then Donald Kochan, then Tawni is going to do her part live. Thank you so much for being with us.
Greetings. Thank you to Alex Tokarev and Northwood University for hosting this event and for inviting me. My name is Charles Steele, Associate Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College. And today my comments will briefly cover what is ESG, why might it be a problem, and there are several problems, some very serious ones. I'm especially going to cover one that comes from economics that I think has received very little attention. Finally, I'll say something about maybe how we should respond. And my comments are going to assume that the listener already understands that the free enterprise system delivers a higher standard of living and more freedom for people than any other system. The free market system, as it's often called, has made us the wealthiest, healthiest people ever to inhabit the planet. I'm going to explain later why that's so. But it's important to understand that this is our starting position, and we should not do anything that harms or destroys this system. If you don't understand this at present, hold it as a working hypothesis for the moment, for the sake of argument. I will make it clear before we're done. So, what is ESG? And we'll see if my slides will go here. There we are. ESG is a set of metrics, measures, or goals that are designed to augment normal profit loss accounting. These metrics supposedly measure environmental performance, social performance, and performance in governance for a firm. In other words, instead of asking whether a firm created value for customers and value for shareholders as revealed by profit and loss, ESG adds all sorts of other goals. Environmental would include things like carbon footprint, water use, solid waste, recycling, possible role in deforestation, etc. Social, well, those metrics would incorporate things like relations without those who are outside the firm, that is, employees and the wider community. So, for example, does a firm have enough diversity hires from underrepresented groups? Is the firm supporting the community with donations to groups like Black Lives Matter? It was just revealed that Black Lives Matter received something like $83 million in corporate donations. Are you involved with disfavored products like firearms, tobacco, fossil fuels? That would bring down an ESG score. Governance. Governance refers to how a firm governs itself. Does it have a sufficiently diverse board, enough members of different identity groups? Does it have worker representation on the board? Which really means, is it unionized? And are unions on the board? Does it have the firm have a sustainability strategy? Does it make the right political contributions? The idea is that in addition to the bottom line, The firm's performance should be judged on these non-pecuniary criteria. Now, even if one agrees with all of the criteria, ESG is a very bad idea, as we'll see. Why is ESG a problem? Well, there are three ways ESG might be imposed: voluntarily, voluntarily, and involuntarily. Voluntary. Well, if a firm's owners simply choose on their own to adopt certain standards, that's unobjectionable. They bear the costs and they bear the benefits. In fact, the great economist Milton Friedman notes this in his famous article, "The Social Role of Business is to Make Profits." But in fact, much of the move today towards ESG is voluntary in name only. Voluntary. It involves third-party determination of metrics and third-party monitoring and third-party enforcement. And these things can induce firm owners to do activities they would otherwise not do. And that's dangerous. And once we're there, it's only a short step to mandating ESG. The Securities and Exchange Commission is already contemplating adopting ESG standards, and the Biden administration has considered imposing them on pension funds. Cornell law professor Soleil Umorova has proposed that the Federal Reserve take over the allocation of all credit and do so using ESG standards. So potentially, this could take us to a fully blown central economic planning system. But suppose we only use ESG to augment profit and loss accounting. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, to answer, we have to consider what the purpose of business and free enterprise is. The role of commerce is to create value. It is to put our limited resources to work to create goods, services, and incomes that sustain our lives and the lives of those around us, including future generations. To be productive means to create value. Now, I emphasize creating value because merely making stuff is not production in the economic sense. Production is creating things that are more valuable than your firm began with. And profit and loss is our only way of determining whether the things we are doing create value or not. Consider what profit really is. Profit, of course, is the total revenue earned by a firm minus its costs of operating. That is to say, it is the price of goods that are sold, the quantity of goods sold times the price consumers are willing to pay for them, or that buyers are willing to pay, less the cost of the resources used in making those goods. Price on the revenue side is a signal from buyers of the relative value that they place on a product. Cost shows the value of the resources if they had been used in other lines of production. It's the value that those resources could have created if we had not utilized them. There's an enormous amount of information being communicated in prices, profits, and losses. If profit is positive, it means the firm has created value. The firm owner wins. Consumers win. Resources are creating more value than before. On the other hand, if profit is negative, that is a loss, then the firm has mistakenly taken resources away from a more valued use. It has wasted resources. Loss is a signal to stop, to change the course, and to do something different. And there is no other way to tell these things except by the profit and loss signals. So, if a firm earns profit, it means it created value for buyers. And this is why Milton Friedman, the great economist, insisted the social responsibility of a firm is to make profits. I cannot emphasize this enough. Profit is not an extra cost that is tacked onto the price of a good. Profitable trade is mutually beneficial. To earn profit shows a business has created value for someone. Well, what does the pursuit of profit in a free enterprise system mean for society at large? Here's a graph that shows what happened to world per capita income after the world began to adopt the free enterprise system. That hockey stick of world income is shocking. It is revolutionary. Notice that's world GDP, world output per person, per capita. And just in case someone thinks this is only about material wealth, take a look at this next slide. No country in the world has a lower life expectancy today than the countries with the highest life expectancy in 1800. That is why I say we are the wealthiest, healthiest people who ever lived. This is what the pursuit of profit accomplishes in a free enterprise system with protected private property rights, free markets, freedom to contract, and freedom to trade. The system does so because an unimpeded price system lets us calculate profit and loss so that we can identify the creation of value. ESG would threaten that by substituting other metrics for profit and loss. There's no objective way to do that, and any proposed rate of substitution will be arbitrary. So, for example, suppose I own a firm and it is regularly making losses. How many carbon offsets and how many diversity hires should it take to compensate and get me a favorable rate in the loan markets? Now, that question is absurd, and yet, if we understand the meaning of profit and loss, it is inherent. That idea is still inherent in the ESG concept. So here are 5 problems then with ESG. First of all, do the standards really make sense? So, environmental. Wrong slide. Well, we'll leave that up. Environmental. Typically, any alleged carbon offset or any recycling is considered to be good, and yet the actual results might be non-existent or even harmful. Carbon offsets often involve essentially just paying someone to undertake actions that allegedly reduce carbon entering the atmosphere. So, for example, planting trees or not planting a crop, but the alleged reductions are imaginary. They're not measured. And much recycling is actually a source of pollution. So, for example, plastic recycling is nearly impossible, and much of the recycled plastic ends up being shipped abroad, often polluting less developed countries where it goes, or ending up in the oceans. It would be less harmful to simply incinerate it, producing energy, or to bury it in American landfills. Yet ESG metrics encourage this harmful activity. Or think about the social side. Are people being hired for the sake of diversity actually competent? ESG gives no points for competence. Or governance. ESG incentivizes goals other than creating value. Yet that's the one thing that businesses are potentially good at. Well, this raises a second issue. Why should we think that firm managers have any special insight into tackling environmental or social issues? It's difficult enough task to consistently create net value in a dynamic economy. ESG complicates the task of business, that is, creating value. It does it by raising costs without offering any real benefits. Now, somebody might bring up the issue of externalities, but externalities call for marginal adjustments. ESG makes no pretense of measuring externalities or making marginal adjustments. A third problem with ESG is that, unfortunately, ESG could become a useful tool for less competent and less honest management. Less competent managers could deploy ESG to cover their failings. If they can't be profitable, they can at least get a high ESG score and claim superior performance to a more profitable firm that has a lower ESG score. And well-connected firms could even use ESG standards to hurt their competitors and gain an advantage. A fourth problem with ESG is that it threatens to turn business vehicles in business firms into vehicles for social engineering. That's not the proper role of a business, and especially not limited liability corporations. Corporations are given limited liability in order to facilitate raising capital so that they can create value. It is wrong that this protected status be used to engineer society. Note that the average citizen has no control over corporations. If systemic changes are needed, other institutions are supposed to address this. Voting, legislatures, Congress, courts, not business firms. ESG is inherently anti-freedom and anti-democratic. Fifth, and finally, and this is my slide, there's one other problem with ESG that I think has been largely overlooked. ESG is inherently a form of in-kind central planning. In the socialist calculation debates of the 1920s and 1930s, one of the first socialist proposals was for something called calculation in kind. Socialists proposed simply comparing different quantities of different goods directly with no common denominator. It was, as Ludwig von Mises pointed out, the least workable of the socialist schemes because there is no standard for comparison. Any comparison made will be arbitrary. ESG is at least partially substituting ESG metrics for prices and profits, but any substitution is arbitrary, and whoever is setting the metrics and the goals becomes a quasi-central planner, subject to the same kinds of blindnesses and the same opportunism as a socialist central planning board. Any calculation of trade-offs between profit and ESG goals is arbitrary. Value creation is thus sacrificed to ESG scoring. The ESG metric destroys value and threatens and suppresses that income hockey stick that I showed you. So, how should we respond? ESG threatens to hurt people. What should we do? Well, first, it's important to understand ESG and to recognize that it really is a serious threat. It has the potential to fundamentally change our economic system and our society for the worse. Major business schools, such as Harvard and Wharton, are adopting ESG into their curriculum. Major corporations are getting behind it. Some governments are mandating ESG or contemplating this. However, this trend can be stopped and reversed. How and why? Well, ESG will fail because it is based on a false understanding of the economy. The laws of reality, the laws of economics are stacked against it. It won't create a sustainable utopia that the proponents imagine. It actually makes things worse, and it cannot work. Already, investors are beginning to recognize that ESG funds tend to have worse economic returns, and often they have worse environmental performance. Firms that are heavily promoting ESG in their own behavior are similarly finding they have poor performance. For example, the recent collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in California. So ESG is a failing proposition, but we need to help it fail with substantial pushback. And that pushback comes from, will have to come from, the business community, the general public, and from the academic world. And by all of those, I mean you. Our next generation of business leaders needs to understand the importance of creating value and not following ideological trends. There's no reason to apologize for making profit. It should be something that businesses are proud of. Those who understand this will become more valuable in the marketplace, and they will also contribute more to building that hockey stick that is of benefit to everyone. The ESG bandwagon fails. Students from schools such as Northwood University or my own Hillsdale College will be uniquely situated to take advantage and to lead in building a successful economy and a successful future if they understand this. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Donald Kochan. I am a professor of law at the George Mason University Antonin Scalia Law School, where I'm also serve as the executive director of the Law and Economics Center. It's a pleasure to be with you and honor to be here at the 45th Freedom Seminar. I want to thank Northwood University as well as Alex Tokoroff, Professor Tokoroff, for inviting me to be part of this program. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about corporate governance and ESG, and most particularly, I'm going to talk about how ESG challenges some of the fundamental notions of corporate governance that, in fact, help to facilitate overall prosperity, enhancing activities and investment in our society, and some of the concerns that we should have if indeed we are to go in the direction of greater ESG. And so let me start off with just the proposition that all of corporate governance is about controlling bad incentives. In my very first few minutes, what I want to talk to you about is this idea that corporate form needs to stay in its traditional place if we are indeed to incentivize the kind of investment that leads to economic growth and prosperity. One of the things about the traditional notion of the corporation is that it is designed in a principal-agent relationship. That is, we have a separation of ownership and control. A fundamental characteristic of the public corporation is that the owners, that is the shareholders, are separate and apart from the controllers, that is the managers of the corporation. And this is quite intentional because many people like you and me probably don't know how to run a major corporation. We don't know how to run Apple or a Dow or whatever the corporation might be, but we do have some money that we can invest. And the people who know how to run those corporations, the people with the great expertise to manage, might not be the folks who actually have the capital in order to bring their ideas to market. And so the brilliance of the corporation was that it allowed for individuals to invest in a productive enterprise of the corporation, we get limited liability, so they would be incentivized to invest. In other words, they don't take on the debts or the liabilities of the corporation when they invest. And they can diversify, they can invest across a number of different corporations. And then we get the people who actually know how to run things to run the corporations, and they become the agents of the owners or the agents of the principals. And that really is where we saw this dramatic increase in productive activity, was this invention of the corporation and the separation of ownership control, because there's only so much you can do if you're a sole proprietor and having to fund your entire business, or you're having to seek out investors who don't have limited liability and aren't really willing to take a risk on you in terms, maybe they're willing to take a financial risk, but they're not willing to take on the larger risk of really being responsible for the activities of the business. And then there's partnerships which have their own limitations. And we could have an entire lecture about the different kinds of business forms, but the corporation allows for this really kind of brilliant incentivized investment structure that we don't see in other kinds of business forms. But that leads to agency costs, because we have the principals in a principal-agent relationship. We have this obligation of the agents to follow the direction of the principals. They have to act in the best interest of the principals. They have to do this in a way that in fact, is consistent with the direction of the principals. They have to do it in a way that maximizes the overall benefits to the principals. They cannot be self-interested as agents, but instead they should be aligned. Nonetheless, we sometimes see that that doesn't happen, and we need to figure out how do we control so that the agent is as closely aligned as possible with the principal. And when they are not aligned, that's what we get, what are called agency costs. Agency costs arise when the managers of the firm are not being loyal agents of the shareholders and not committed to maximizing shareholder value. In other words, they might be pursuing their own interests. They might be trying to do their own, achieve their own agenda, line their own pockets, whatever it might be. So you need some kind of relationship and obligations that are enforceable. There are profits lost if an agent is steering away from what the principal wants. But there are also monitoring costs. That is, we as principals want to minimize the amount of money we have to spend to figure out whether or not our agents are actually doing things right. And this could be whether it's our lawyers who are our agents, whether it's our real estate agents, whether it's the mechanics who are fixing our car. We want to find shortcuts, small ways, inexpensive ways in which we can monitor and figure out whether or not they're acting consistent with our interests or whether they're deviating from those. And so agency costs are going to be positive in the sense that anytime an agent is not aligned and doing things that are contrary to the interests of the principal, you will have costs. And so too, then you have costs of monitoring on the part of the principal. You want to minimize both. And how do we do that? Well, the corporation does it quite well. The corporation does it by asking, what should our purpose be? And that purpose is defined by asking the question, what do shareholders want? And if shareholders truly want a return on their investment, that is, they want to maximize the value of their investment in financial terms, and then that should be the purpose of the corporation. They are the principals, after all. They are giving the direction to the agents who are managing the corporation what they should do. And so the principals are saying, we want you to maximize the value of our investment financially. That's what you should do. And I think you can challenge even the most progressive-minded individuals who invest in the stock market, invest in public corporations. Why are you investing? I think very few of them are going to say, I'm investing for any purpose other than expecting a return on that investment financially. And so if that is the case, then we also have an easy way to judge whether or not the managers are doing a good job. Because we just look at the stock price. Is it going up or is it going down? We don't have to sort of guess at whether or not they're doing a good job. And we don't have to even know what they're doing to know whether or not they're doing a good job. We just can measure. There's a metric there. There's a definable, agreed upon, universal metric, comparative across corporations that we can use to evaluate the effective, whether or not the agents are straying away from the objectives of their principles. So what we have then is, does this work if we switch to an ESG model of this? And I'm going to occasionally look down at my clock. I apologize, but I do want to make sure that I stay within time. So when we're asking ourselves, will we get the same results if we adopt a model in which ESG is our principal focus? That is, we want to focus not on the shareholders, but we want to focus on stakeholders. We'll get to that in just a minute. Are we going to get the same thing? Well, I want to start with this graph, right, that you see here, which is that there's been sort of this change in the debate. This is a Google Ngram. It reflects what kind of the frequency of word usage over time in books, and the books being a proxy for a general sort of conversation within society. Interestingly, and perhaps scarily, there is a decline in shareholder, as emphasis on shareholders, and there is a dramatic uptick in our use of the word stakeholder, which was not, you can see, lies flat, if not non-existent prior to this, because it wasn't really something we were concerned about. It's not part of that traditional notion of things. Why? Because the shareholder value maximization view is the historic view of the corporation. It is the traditional view. It is the one that makes the most sense. And Milton Friedman puts this very well, in which both Capitalism and Freedom, as well as in a famous New York Times op-ed, in which he says there's one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. Brief aside, many people do not focus on that rules of the game part. A corporation is required to comply with all universally applicable environmental laws, labor laws. And so there is, that the shareholder value maximization doesn't say you can skirt the law. You're still going to have to comply with the law, as well as general notions of not committing fraud and free and fair open competition rules. This is also important because I think we should pause here a moment and say, when we start seeing people call for ESG, that we say there should be mandates to do something other than maximize shareholder value. You should be concerned. A corporation has a duty to the environment. A corporation has a duty to society and social reform. A corporation has a duty to create progressive governance rules. if you do any of those things, what those advocates are saying is that you should do that through changing the purpose of the corporation. Note, you could do all of those same things by passing legislation. And if you did, then even within the shareholder value maximization view, the corporation would need to comply with those things. In fact, that's what our environmental laws do. That's what our environmental regulations do. That's what our labor laws do. But the reason why many of the advocates want to push ESG through the corporate purpose debate is because they can't get what they want or can't get as much as what they want in the legislature. Legislation's hard. Bicameralism and present. There's a lot of hurdles to legislation. Instead, they want to shove it through corporate purpose because it's easier, perhaps, to change the world by changing those standards. And that's an important caveat, because the energy could be redirected. The advocacy energy could be redirected to say, look, corporations, you need to comply with stricter environmental laws. You need to comply with stricter labor laws. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about most ESG movements. Now, very briefly, I want to talk to you about a famous case that came out of Michigan, Dodge versus Ford Motor Company. Briefly summarizing, there was a dividend that was due to shareholders. Ford wanted to redirect that dividend to the employees, and the Michigan Supreme Court slapped Henry Ford down. They said the business corporation is organized and carried on primarily for the profit of the stakeholders. Consequently, the powers of the directors are to be employed for that end, and the discretion of directors does not extend to a change in the end itself, to the reduction of profits, or to the non-distribution of profits among stockholders in order to devote them to other purposes. Note that what this is saying is that under the traditional notion of corporate governance, the managers, the agents, do not even have the discretion to take into account anything other than the overall value to the stakeholders. Very important, because that becomes the fiduciary duty. Indeed, the court held that it is not within the lawful powers of board of directors to shape and conduct the affairs of a corporation for the merely incidental benefit of shareholders and for the primary purpose of benefiting others. In other words, there's no stakeholder capitalism built into the traditional notion of the corporation. The corporation was there designed to have a single metric in which we would judge the conduct of the managers based on whether or not they were increasing shareholder value. Shareholders could not be incidental to some other greater purpose, what was considered greater purpose on the part of the managers. So the Supreme Court continued in that 1919 opinion that no one will contend that if the avowed purpose of the defendant directors was to sacrifice the interests of the shareholders, it would not be the duty of the courts to interfere. Now, of course, what they're saying, duty of the courts to interfere if a lawsuit is brought. So if a lawsuit is brought by the shareholders saying you are deviating from your obligation, your fiduciary duty to us, then the courts have to enforce the duty. It's inside the contract of the corporation. And to deviate away from that would do a couple of things, right? First, it would violate the contractual terms that you have with your principal, your shareholders, your commander. It would also discourage investment. I mean, who's going to invest in a corporation that can steer themselves away from actually maximizing the value of your investment? It would drown out investment. That's what the ESG movement threatens to do, to drown out the incentive to invest in a way that will be detrimental to the economy, because people don't know that if I put $1 in, I should expect that the managers are going to try to get $2 out. Instead, I'm saying if I'm putting $1 in, I'm giving it to the managers to use their discretion as to how they want to spend that dollar, no matter what, even if it brings me back zero. That's not a good deal. Shareholders are not going to be willing to do that. All right. Now, another thing about the part of the traditional arguments here is that, look, social causes can still get funded. They'll just get funded indirectly. In fact, you shouldn't dilute the effectiveness of corporations' return profits, because if they return profits, they can actually give those to the shareholders, and then the shareholders can have choice, autonomy in deciding what kinds of causes they want their money to go toward. Note that the shareholders don't get a choice. The managers are making the choice for the shareholders if they're deciding, well, I think your money is not as good in your pocket as it is if I devote it to this social reform movement or to this environmental cause. So you maximize autonomy, you maximize profits first off, then you maximize autonomy by doing this, and that certainly seems to be the better way to go. But what we had is that the Business Roundtable came in back in 2019 and suggested that the purpose of the corporation is not, in fact, to benefit shareholders, but instead it is to benefit all of the stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. Consequently, you have a multi-metric system, which is going to be much harder to judge. Note that even one of the roundtable members who didn't sign it said exactly that. He said, this is Steve Schwartzman in the second bullet here. He said that while companies must consider stakeholders, focusing on all of them equally would make it difficult for him as a CEO to know what he's supposed to do. Am I supposed to focus on this person today or that person today? A great example is a car company in Detroit or anywhere in Michigan, right? That has to decide, I'm going to build electric cars. Well, they would say, good for the environment, right? But it's really bad for workers because electric cars actually make far fewer workers. And then is it really good for the environment? Because now I've got to consider the issue of the batteries and whether the batteries cause a problem. And then wait, is that good for the social context and the social fabric? Because if there's fewer jobs, then there's going to be less money going into the communities, which means the communities might fall into disrepair. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to open the new electric car factory and help save the environment? Or am I supposed to keep the old factory and help save the jobs and the communities? Or am I supposed to, that's the kind of social planning that we don't want anyone making, especially a corporation who has a different purpose. Now, there's a lot of ways in which we can challenge the assumptions in ESG, including the idea that ESG movements assume markets will not generate ESG goods. I'd love to talk to you about that in the Q&A. ESG also takes a static view without considering trade-offs. For example, if there's no corporation, there's no stakeholder. So if we are sucking out the profits of the corporation by wasting them upon non-revenue generating causes, there'll be fewer profits and there may be no corporation at all. Then where is the, where are the employees? Then where are these other stakeholders that are listed there? How do the communities fare if the companies have to shut down? If shareholders can't monitor managers, there may be no investment again, meaning there's no corporation to create stakeholders in the first place. So if we don't get investors, if we disincentivize investment, you're never going to get the corporations in the first place, which can contribute all these jobs and contribute this money into the economy. Again, something that gets lost in the static view. ESG also does not, look at specialization. Corporations aren't, what are they good at? They're good at maximizing profits. They are not good at figuring out what charitable causes to donate to. That's not why we pick managers. That's not why we should. So you specialize, let charities do what they do, let corporations do what they do. Let me conclude in my last few minutes here with a couple things about why a single metric versus a multi-metric system is better for determining whether or not the managers are in fact performing well, and why that's so critical. It's all about agency costs, right? Again, back to the start. Are the shareholders' interests being adequately represented by senior management and the board of directors? And if we, again, define what do shareholders want, pretty universally, they say they want to see a return on their investment. Are they adequately represented by senior management and the board of directors who say return on investments not our only goal? No. And then how do you judge whether or not they're doing well? Like I said before, if you have a single metric, you can figure out that they're doing very well on or not doing very well on that one metric. If though there is a corporation who has a multi-metric system, then you would have a situation in which, this quarter I didn't do so well on financial returns, but you know what I was really, really good at is I signed a lot of petitions. And so we really gained a good name in the community as a result of that. And how do you judge, what that also does is that gives the manager cover now. In other words, managers like this. Why do you think so many managers, without actually consulting their board of directors, sign that business roundtable statement? Because it gives them cover for bad performance. It gives them an opportunity to say, no, I did great this quarter. I just did really great on this metric. And they shift it around. Whichever one they decide they wanted to do best on, they'll say, yes, you can't fire me. I did really well on E this quarter. Next quarter, I didn't do so well on E. That's because I was focused on S. And then where do profits fit in? Well, if I make them here or there, maybe if I do really well on profits, I'll say, actually, I did really well on profits this time because I wasn't focused as much on E. Again, that's just not the system that we designed. So back to this for just a moment. Shareholder maximization, value maximization, and boards. There's a formal reason to stick to it. It's inherent in the contract, and the relationship is a legal obligation. And there's a functional reason. A single objective goal like and this is quoting from Robert Charles Clark in his famous treatise on corporate law, a single objective goal like profit maximization is more easily monitored than a multiple vaguely defined goal like fair and reasonable accommodation of all affected interests. And if you do have that mushy goal, sets of different goals, that means the agents can't be held to really much of a standard at all. And so it insulates them from accountability. Corporate social responsibility or sustainable governance or ESG responsibility and the like are difficult to define, mean different things to different people. That also makes it difficult to judge. Some shareholders are going to view the E in a different way than others are. And again, you don't have an objective standard as to what it means to be good on any of these metrics. And we can talk, I'm sure, in the Q&A period about the ratings agencies, which themselves are extremely flawed and trying to somehow create metrics for any of these things. So we have the centuries of weighing in, academics weighing in. There's no single definition of corporate social responsibility. There's no single definition of ESG. I like this great quote from back when ESG used to be called CSR, and that's defining CSR is, as the saying goes, like trying to nail Jello to the wall. You can't really figure this out. And so again, it becomes impossible to monitor, impossible to measure, impossible to monitor, and thus impossible to hold people accountable. That allows for pretext or cover for underperformance. It also allows managers to always justify their actions. It means that the duties are often internally contradictory, like my electric vehicles example. And really, it's something which we are not well equipped to engage in this. And in the end, again, it's going to, it could be the death knell for corporate governance if, in fact, we continue down this road to ESG, which really does not give us a way to measure. And if there's not a good way to measure, and there's a possibility of shirking on the part of managers from their duties to advance the interests of the shareholders, then we could very well see a dramatic decrease in investment, which will be detrimental to our overall prosperity enhancing function that corporations bring. I look forward to your questions during the Q&A. Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep. Loud and clear. Put your thumbs up again, guys.
Good.
Thank you. Okay, am I ready to start?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. I know that there's a danger in being the last speaker, but I'm Tawni Ferrarini, and I'm coming to you from Northwood University. You know the topic, and let's get started. It's an interesting topic, and it's one that's dear to my heart because there are these strengths, these weaknesses, and opportunities that we can talk about, and we want to understand the role of competitive profits and losses and understand them in the capacity of a flourishing society. Next, we have this incredible record of human prosperity and contributions made by sound institution and market economies. You've heard a lot about the hockey stick of prosperity. We're going to speak a little more about that. And then we're going to lay out the unintended consequences of moving up that ESG priority list at the expense of sustainable profits in a global economy. And then finally, we'll conclude with identifying some ESG threats to future generations, which means all of you sitting in the audience today, and actions that you can take in order to address them. So all of us know by this point in our day, the role of profit and losses. Businesses simply that fail to adjust to circumstances that are changing their environment, as well as advancements in technologies, will likely cease to exist. They're subject to what Schumpeter calls creative destruction. Just look at Blockbuster versus Netflix. Do any of you have experience going in and getting a VHS movie in Blockbuster? No, you don't. You really. Oh my goodness, it's incredible. But bottom line, when you look at the balance sheets of these two entities and you look at the revenues and you compare them to the costs, it's easy to understand why Netflix sustained itself and Blockbuster exited. You can look at the history of the cell phone. It has a similar story. And the bottom line is that in this world, we have experienced more technological advancement in the last 250 plus years than at any other point in human history. It's a credible story. And all we have to do is we just kind of like dig in deep and we look at Milton Friedman's 4 ways to spend money. All of us, each individual, is more careful with the earned money that we have available to us when we're spending it on ourselves. We compare the benefits to the cost and we make a purchase when the perceived benefits are greater than the cost. Otherwise, we walk away. Similarly, the business that's selling the phone will look at the revenue that we're bringing into the business, compare it to the cost of supplying the product, and they'll say no if we're not willing to pay the price that they need in order to cover the cost. So the most efficient form of spending is that spending that provides the highest value for the least cost. And that's true of both the business as well as the consumer. When you flip to the very far corner and you have other people spending other people's money on different things, that's where the relationship between what is valued and the cost starts to break down. And the greater the distance, the more room for error there is. And the more room for error, the less likely we're going to get prosperity, especially sustainable prosperity. You've heard a lot about the statistics, and my specialty is bringing meaning to the statistics so they can enter your lives, but also your hearts. So if you go back and you look at some of the historical documents or even popular media pieces, and you go back more than 300, 400, 500, 600 years, you'll see that the majority of people lived in extreme poverty. In fact, up to 1776 in the United States, we had the status of a third world nation. But we see this amazing engine starting to grow, and what we call the Industrial Revolution comes about. Well, why is that? Well, what happened is individuals like you and me and others that we don't even know, we gained rights to personal property and the ability to navigate through markets. And we were allowed to pursue our life, our liberty, and what we deemed happiness. But everyone, we had to bear the costs. We had to look at the trade-offs. And therefore, because we were responsible for spending the money that we earned, we were more careful with that spending. On the flip side of that, businesses that emerged, what they did is they valued whatever it is that we valued as consumers. And so not only do you get with the hockey stick of prosperity, healthier and wealthier living, you get also a greener environment, one that is more environmentally friendly. And you see that technology advances, so it reduces the cost of the people who are living at the very bottom of the income ladder, not only in the United States, but also around the world. And as mentioned by the previous speakers and the speakers throughout your day, this is at the foundation. At the foundation, we have limited government that protects our rights to person and property. And as long as we don't bring harm to hurt to others, we can navigate as we wish. We can act and interact in whatever environment we want. We also have we have sound access to money. And in a previous session, they were talking about why that is at threat with the current monetary and fiscal policies. Freedom to trade internationally is at the heart of what we do. And then we have regulation of credit, and we have sound access to credit, labor, and business. Other improvements not only include the green technology, but they also include things that we value. Life expectancy improves, access to public sanitation, access to education, women's rights and others' rights improve and move more closely to gender equality and equality with others. And access to capital expands. It becomes more diversified across larger groups and includes them. And the right to vote improves. So the reality is for most of human history, to circle us back, people lived in extreme poverty. We had the monarchs, we had the people at the top ruling the classes at the bottom. But as the institutions and the empowered individuals like you and me and others, those that shop at Walmart, those who go to the highest stores, we all have a responsibility to earn our money and use it in meaningful, purposeful ways. And when we step back and we look at the things that have happened around the globe, we see it's incredible. In 2015, the World Bank had earlier set a goal of eradicating extreme poverty. Hop online, look quickly. They have made significant progress in tracking the number of people living in extreme poverty, and they've actually met their goal earlier than planned, and they credit open and free trade for that progress. Open and free trade for that progress. So, bottom line, we've heard our previous speakers talk about the relationship between revenues and costs. And as we move into the business side of this, the revenues are generated by the businesses, entrepreneurs, the corporations, by satisfying customers who are willing to pay or sacrifice their earned income so that the businesses can turn around and cover their costs. Those costs include wages and salaries paid to labor, the rent that goes towards land, the interest that's paid for the use of business capital, and of course, and last but not least, the proprietor's income for the entrepreneurial talent that is provided. Responsible business behavior and profit maximization move in tandem in a market economy. Why is that? Because we're free to choose. If we, as the consumer, don't agree with the product and the services that the businesses are providing, we're free to choose to turn away. And it's this freedom to choose and the connection between what it is that we value and the cost that we incur that provides individuals, businesses and consumers alike with the incentives to move forward, to prosper, to help others flourish. Because it's not about me, or I, in the free market economy. It's about we, and us, in ourselves flourish, others. And when we step back and we look at some of the things that go on in the world today, it's in the market economies that the costs of providing bad service or mistreatment of consumers, and you go down, you are in unsafe neighborhoods, you're damaging the environment, and others can see and witness it. You're selling inferior products. In a competitive market, those business owners do what? They shut the doors, they close their businesses, because the only way for them to stay in business in a free market economy is by serving consumers in ways that they value. By serving consumers in ways that they value at a cost that covers what they are paying in terms of labor, and the list goes on, and other resources. So, as you've heard numerous times over, the corporate executive's role is to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of society. Those are the foundational institutions that I spoke about. This is the corporate executive's role. It is that role to be socially responsible. So, as we've heard, previous speakers have mentioned that a corporate executive is that individual who serves the shareholders. And the company owners typically pursue those profits while managing costs. Again, the relationship between the revenues and the costs on balance sheets accounted for are most important because they provide the measurements in which the businesses and the corporations understand whether they're delivering valuable services to the consumers at acceptable prices. And you can read what's happening here. It's the corporate executive's role to make as much money possible while conforming to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law, the rules of the game, the institutions, as well as those embodied in ethical custom. So how would all of you feel about Elon Musk choosing what the ESG initiative of the day is going to be? What happens when he moves away from his corporate responsibilities is he starts picking and choosing those priorities that may or may not cover the costs of providing them. And this makes us or causes us to move beyond the simple function of having corporations and businesses motivated and incentivized by the pursuit of profits. We have two types of capitalism that are starting to emerge or have emerged in the literature. We have the shareholder capitalism and the stakeholder capitalism. The shareholder capitalism emerges when executives and shareholders decide which ESG or other nonprofit goal to pursue. And predictably, the trade-off is, rather than pursuing those profits in which the business provides value to the customer at acceptable prices, they turn and they pick and choose which ESG initiatives to pursue at the expense of stakeholders. Moving over to the stakeholder capitalism. This surfaces when there are needs of all the stakeholders in a community, the employees, the customers, the partners, in society as a whole. And what's happening here is they are picking and choosing, again, which to pursue out of all of these, but there's no question asked about the consideration. What is it going to cost in order to deliver these programs? And what is the cost compared to the benefit? And what is it that we're sacrificing by pursuing this ESG initiative? An example is forthcoming. Here it is. Bjorn Lomber did a great job. He brought together policymakers, corporate executives, nonprofits, and the list goes on. And he wanted to measure and discuss what the priorities were with ESG initiatives. He wanted to look at cost considerations, and he brought in the concept of opportunity costs. I know it's the vein of most econ students, but it's an important concept. And what we see when we look around the globe, especially those that are tracking the different movements in Africa and the various countries within, is that we see individuals and policymakers will celebrate Africa, according to the Center for Global Development, exactly. It now gets 50% of its energy from renewables. ESG supporters will say this is a great accomplishment. For $10 billion, we're lifting out 20 million people from poverty in Africa. But wait a minute, this is where the economists come in. This is how they understand and they look at the alternatives. It sounds impressive until you look at the opportunity costs. If gas electrification was chosen over renewable energies, that $10 billion would have lifted approximately 90 million people out of poverty. 90 million people. So one of the costs of following the ESG initiative is that 70 million people continue to live in darkness and in poverty. As Milton Friedman says, there is no such thing as a free lunch. And if you're interested in this, go ahead and look at The Economist. You'll have access to my PowerPoints after. So there's been pressure on Jeff Bezos and others to get involved in the ESG initiative. I don't know about you, but I would rather have Jeff Bezos attend to Amazon needs, because his philanthropic record is not very good. He's a specialist in working on all things Amazon and connected to it. By shifting his talent, his energy, and his resources into the ESG movement, we're going to have some of the problems that we just talked about. Bezos got rich or wealthy by helping others like us. Can you imagine going through the pandemic without Amazon and similar services? Amazon provided retailers with services that they couldn't get otherwise. They brought goods and services into our households. So when we look at the morality of ESG movements, we have to recognize that they are moving about. ESG is very prominent in some circles. To ignore it is not logical. It doesn't make common sense. But what's happening is we're seeing is now the natural environment is becoming a stakeholder. And it's called what many refer to from Rawls onward in 2011, sustainable capitalism. So now it's starting to connect economic prosperity, environmental quality, and social equity all together. Issues are plentiful. What is meant by environmental quality and social equity is fluid. The pursuits of these initiatives are disruptive. They take us away from things that could help us be more productive and help many more people, especially those living in marginalized communities. And bottom line is they really impose some high cost on existing workers with specialized skills, as well as firms with these niche markets. So consider oil. There's no system of checks and balances on these ESG policies. There is no measurement and how they are holding themselves and others accountable for bringing value to individuals in meaningful ways. There's limited data, and the balance sheets simply aren't kept because the motivation and the incentive is not there to do so. Go back to the 4 quadrants of spending. So when we bring this all together and we think about it, we have an opportunity. We've had this incredible opportunity for the last 250 plus years. Competitive profits and losses accelerate healthy, wealthy ESG initiatives, not only for the people who are at the top, but more importantly, for the people who are at the bottom. It brings out these competitive profits and losses, brings out a moral sense of responsibility and accountability, that business stay in business by satisfying their customers in the ways that the customers value at acceptable prices. There's a weakness. We do know that there are instances where businesses exploit. That's the role of the limited government. But progress is here. Consider the record of human prosperity, recognizing the contributions of the past, especially the soundness of institutions. And when thinking about these issues, especially in the future, if you're a policymaker or have influence over policymakers, consider the trade-offs, track the unintended consequences, and remember that the market economy always provides a viable alternative. And you can cancel or help cancel some of the ESG threats to future generations. It's important to take actions that are purposeful and encourage others to do the same. I am optimistic about your future because we have young people sitting in the room. And for that, I thank you. And I want to say thank you especially to Northwood University and all of you who are in the room. If you're interested in this and you want to go to Kappa Taft, Milton Friedman and Rose Friedman's summer home, there are summer programs college students. And with that, I'll conclude. Do we have any questions, or how do you want to handle this? I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Okay, we have time just for one question for all three panelists, and the microphone goes to one of our best students here, an economics major, Andrew Redder.
All right, so here's something that maybe all of you can address. Some businesses would say that they're facing just as much, if not more, pressure from consumers as they are from the government to pursue ESG initiatives. They suggest that through the influence of politicians, other celebrities, and other influencers, particularly the younger generation, is going to demand this from businesses. And it seems to me that that would be a different ballgame. Do you agree with this? And what do you think could be done about this?
Well, this is Charles Steele. I don't know if, can you hear me? At least Tawni can hear me. Well, that's great. I'm really skeptical of that. Some of the ESG funds seem to have performed really poorly compared to standard funds. If consumers actually are, first of all, I'll say two things about that. First of all, consumers often cannot identify what the carbon footprint of a product is. It's just all propaganda if they have any idea at all. And I'm pretty skeptical that most people pay much attention to that. I think this is mostly a cover that is used by some managers who are trying to go along with this stuff. But there is a second thing, and that's that if consumers don't like a product because of what it stands for, well, that's fine. They don't buy it. And in that case, those firms that don't meet the consumer demand will be weeded out.
Yeah, this is Donald Kochan. Can you hear me as well? Yes. Okay. So I think Charles has it exactly right, and I'll just amplify a couple things there. One is this idea that where you're hearing that from oftentimes is from the managers themselves, and that gives them a justification for deviating away from their traditional obligations to focus on value, and it just helps them tell the story of underperformance on value by saying, well, I'm doing this because the consumers wanted me to do this. The second is that it's very difficult to actually measure that then to show that their shift into some other category in order to generate more business actually is happening. And what I think we as shareholders, as observers need to do is to demand and say, sure, if you can prove that this action was actually taken because it is consistent with maximizing shareholder value, it just happens to also be one which is promoting E, S, or G, then that may in fact fit within their mandate. But again, because that's so difficult to value, I think you need to go and really force the owners to say, yes, I'm doing this because it's best for the shareholder value. And here, let me prove to you why this is best for the shareholder value. And it's very difficult for them to actually get to that point. The last thing I'll say on this as well is that I do think that consumers themselves don't understand the trade-offs. And so a lot of times people think that this is something which they can demand for free. And so part of it is about educating the consumers as to what they really want. There's a colleague of mine, James Cooper, here at the Law and Economics Center and a faculty member at Scalia Law School, who works a lot on privacy, for example. And this is a slightly separate field from ESG, but it gives a good example. And there's people that really say they want utmost privacy and they demand, and so they will say that that's a metric that they are going to measure corporations on, is how much privacy do they provide. But then when you actually dig down and ask them, well, are you willing to give up this in order to get that privacy? Do you want to give up the convenience of the ads that you receive, the tailored discounts that you receive and other things? And all of a sudden, people don't want privacy so much. So part of it is about educating the consumers and letting them know that there are trade-offs. It's not free to demand all these things. In the end, it's going to mean they're going to be paying higher prices. They're going to be getting lower wages. They're going to suffer in some way. And I think then once you put a price on what they're asking for and educate them about the price, you would see consumer demands change.
I quickly like to carry on with that line of argument. And all you have to do is turn to the Chilean economy, because recently in September of 2022, Chileans overwhelmingly rejected a proposed constitution that would bring in stronger ESG initiatives, including better serving the indigenous people. And through education and social media, there was a lot of education that came about, and they put a price on what these moves would make or would involve, and people turned away from it, which was surprising. And they had a lot of Hollywood and social media influencers involved in that.
Program and live stream. Everybody, let's thank our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.